Welcome to Lecture 6 on free will. So today we're going to talk about a bunch of different topics surrounding what it would be to be accountable for your actions in a way that is consistent with you having free will. I guess we're going to talk less about accountability, which is an important aspect of the literature on moral responsibility, and talk more about some of the components of free will according to what philosophers nowadays think goes into free will. So here, what are these crazy covers of books that I've put on the first slide? Well, compare the first two, a Goosebumps novel that I read as a kid that was part of the Reader Beware series, and consider also some other choose-your-own-adventure books that are often sci-fi in nature. This one is Space and Beyond, but there's a whole volume or library of books that are choose-your-own-adventure books. And then compare that with your everyday novel, say The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, a great sci-fi fantasy book that I highly recommend when you're done with this course. Won the Hugo Award for... Actually, Jemisin, The Fifth Season is the first book in a trilogy. Each of the book in the trilogy won the Hugo Award every year it was made, every year it was released. So, highly recommend it. But choose-your-own-adventure books are different from regular novels in that choose-your-own-adventure books allow you to determine the way the book's plot goes. So, the way the book's plot goes is not just something you passively observe or read, but something that you, at different points, influence. So if you turn to page, say, 5 of this Reader Beware book, it'll give you a paragraph or two with plot. And then at the end of the page, it'll say, turn to page 74 if you want Alice to go into the basement. Choose page 75 if you think Alice should instead leave the house. And depending on what you choose for Alice, the plot will go in a certain way. So today we're going to talk about free will, which it turns out can be thought of in similar terms. So we're going to look at Daniel Dennett's work on free will, and then we'll turn to an article by Michael Huemer, who's at Colorado, and an essay he wrote for the volume for this course on free will in Minority Report. Okay, so this is this is just first time, but the nature of free will. So what is the nature of free will? We've talked, if you have ever been part of a religious tradition, especially Christianity, the idea of free will is pretty central. In fact, it's part of the earliest parts of the Bible. So in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the idea of free choice is quite important. But the exact nature of free will is still open to dispute amongst people working on free will in philosophy, and in theology for that matter. Free will is often taken to have two necessary conditions. So we're talking here about necessary conditions. I'm not today going to suggest any particular theory of free will. If you looked at the individual theories of free will, they would have much longer list of conditions which they might claim are sufficient conditions for free will. Today we're just going to talk about like two items, more one than the other, that are taken to be necessary conditions on free will. Okay. One is the so-called freedom to do otherwise, or the capacity or, the could do otherwise or capacity to do otherwise condition. This literature is so huge that actually there's differences between all of those different notions, but today we're gonna lump them all together because I want you to just get a feel for it. So the freedom to do otherwise is just the idea that there is more than one future or course of action open to an agent. So, for example, robots with deterministic programs lack this. They lack the freedom to do otherwise. Contrast that with the sourcehood notion. According to the sourcehood notion, an agent controls their own actions or is the proper source of those actions. So this is something that radioactive atoms lack. So radioactive atoms, they can do otherwise. There's some sort of freedom associated with the radioactive emissions from those atoms. But it's not like, the atoms are the source of the way things go. It'll either emit one atom or it won't emit an atom Sorry, well, I guess there's different quantum particles that I'm not naming. But yes, at least some radioactive atoms will emit, and some will not emit atoms. And there's there's a 50% chance of decay. Well, it just seems like, in this case, it's just a mere matter of chance whether that atom will be emitted or not. So, atoms seem to lack sourcehood, at least. Even if there's other futures that are consistent with what atoms do. All right, so these are two necessary conditions. And if you take a course at UCSD on metaethics or on really free will as its own literature, its own area of specialization, in fact, you will see that there's actually a huge dispute about whether these are both necessary conditions on free will. It is currently actually quite fashionable. The work of Dirk Pereboom has made it particularly so, but we'll look at others. It has been somewhat fashionable to say that sourcehood is the main notion, or the one we really care about, whereas the freedom to do otherwise can be dispensed with. All right, but I just want you to know that. It's just important for you to know. What are we actually talking about here? So here's how the histories of a universe would look with only one possible future at a time. So apparently it's passed into popular culture to talk about timelines. So 2020 is apparently on a very bad timeline. Well, when people talk about that, I think what they just mean is this. The timeline is just a series of events that occurs in one history of the world. You can think of this as there's a state of the world, and it can vary over time. So you can think, I don't know, the easiest cookie cutter case would be whether or not my hand is raised or how high my hand is raised. That can change over time. In a single timeline, and this is obviously just super simplified, but this is like one history of the world, one entire timeline of the world, which can vary in this way. And here's another timeline distinct from this one that varies in its own different way. And they're distinct timelines because the state of the world here is different from the state of the world here. Okay? But suppose there could be multiple possible futures at a given point in time. So here's a point in time. On this branching diagram, there's two histories of the world that could branch from this point. History A and History B. All right. So according to the freedom to do otherwise condition, this is how the timelines of the world need to look. Okay? That is, at a certain time, there needs to be at least two possible futures. And particularly two possible futures available to an agent to choose to take on. So it needs to be possible for an agent to choose this timeline or this timeline. If an agent is forced to use this one or forced to choose this one, well, that might be a problem. Okay. So we'll come back to that point in a moment. But the point to just note now is that these are two very different metaphysical outlooks on how the future of the universe unfolds given where we are right now in time. And I should just note, obviously, as I just noted, this is not just important for free will, but it's also important for quantum mechanics. Like quantum mechanics, you might think, at a given time, there's two possible futures available. Okay, so Daniel Dennett on free will. This is Daniel Dennett. Daniel Dennett is surely one of the most famous living philosophers. He is probably most famous in popular culture for his books on atheism. But what's funny is that in philosophy, that's sort of an afterthought. That's absolutely not what he's known for. In philosophy, Daniel Dennett's known primarily for his work in philosophy of mind. So he has a lot of interesting books on intentionality, which we looked at, on phenomenal consciousness, which we've also looked at, in his famous claim that, in some sense, consciousness is an illusion. But also, he has done quite a bit of work on free will. So he's kind of a philosopher's philosopher. He works on all the hard questions. And here he is, I guess, in his home. I think he used to live in Maine or Vermont, somewhere in the New England region. And so he has a farm. And I think recently he gave up the farm and he's doing something else. But yeah, he's just kind of like a badass. All right. But just because he's a badass does not mean he's right. So what does he think about free will and the CDO, which I'll abbreviate this sometimes. This just means could have done otherwise. Okay. So a common view is that free will requires the ability to do otherwise. That is, to do X freely requires that one could have not X'd. Okay? And you could call this the could have done otherwise condition. So Dennett trucks out an example of people saying this in the literature. So this is a very good piece of argumentation because it's giving us evidence that people actually think this. And he gives us direct textual citation. He says, so Dennett quotes Van Inwagen as saying, almost all philosophers agree that a necessary condition for holding an agent responsible for an act is believing that the agent could have refrained from performing that act. Now, Dennett says, it simply does, breaks. So this is what most philosophers think up here. But what Dennett's going to argue in this paper is that it simply does not matter at all to moral responsibility whether the agent in question could have done otherwise in these circumstances, or in the circumstances. So what Dennett is going to try to do is suggest that actually, so let's think about how the debate was going before. The debate before was supposed to be like this. There's one camp of people. Hell, I'll even use my pen. There's one camp of people. Camp one. These people thought that the fact that determinism is true, or the fact that we cannot do otherwise undermines free will. Here's another group of people. The fact that we can do otherwise is important, but we can do otherwise. So here's group one thinks we cannot do otherwise. Group two thinks we can do otherwise. Okay, and both of these camps agree that it's really important to the question of moral responsibility and also free will. For that reason, free will. It's important whether we can do otherwise. Group one says we can't do otherwise. Group two says we can do otherwise. But part of the common ground in this dispute is that it is important for moral responsibility whether we can do otherwise. Whether we can do otherwise is important for moral responsibility. So Dennett's going to say, actually, this entire debate's confused. Because whether I can do otherwise is irrelevant to whether I have moral responsibility in a given case. So how is he going to argue for this? So there's some set of considerations. So first of all, Dennett is talking about moral responsibility as opposed to free will per se. We're going to kind of gloss over this, but I mean, it's important to note there's a step here. So the idea that's very common to read is that moral responsibility depends on free will. In other words, free will is a necessary condition on moral responsibility. And in turn, free will depends on being able to do otherwise. In other words, that being able to do otherwise is a necessary condition on free will. So this chain of necessary conditions is a very common thing to read in philosophy. So if we take this chain seriously, then Dennett's going to indirectly say something about free will here. Okay. So the could have done otherwise requirement arises when we try to assess blame and responsibility, as Dennett brings up. So note that the could have done otherwise condition is generally ignored regarding felicitous unregretted actions. So this is the first observation that Dennett makes. So the first observation Dennett makes with these points is to say, well, look, there are a lot of cases where we don't hold people unresponsible for good things when they don't do otherwise, or when they could not have done otherwise. So here's some data. People often say when they do good things, what else could I do? Or what else could I have done? That's anybody in my situation would have done that. And that's all I would have done. Take this example. Anyone else would have done the same. So in these cases, we don't take the agent to be disavowing responsibility in these cases merely because they seem to suggest that they couldn't have done otherwise. So Dennett's like trying to sort of start off by just observing that it doesn't even seem intuitively true in every case that being able to do otherwise is a necessary condition on being morally responsible. Because in these cases, it seems like we failed the necessary condition. It seems like people would not have done otherwise or could not have done otherwise. But nevertheless, we take them to be morally responsible. So that's weird if we thought that being able to do otherwise, or being able to do otherwise was a necessary condition on moral responsibility. Okay. So Dennett then introduces this idea of local fatalism. He says, we do seem to ask the could have done otherwise question when we focus on the presence of local fatalism. So Dennett's basically saying there is a notion that we're interested in, and it's related to the could have done otherwise question, and it's the idea that locally fated actions are actions for which we tend to say that people are not morally responsible. So here's an example. Being locked in a room. If you're locked in a room, you're locally fated to be in the room. And Dennett thinks, well, in those cases, it makes sense to say that you could not have done otherwise, and we're subject to local fatalism, and it terminates our inquiry into causation. In turn, it's plausible that in most cases like this, you would not be morally responsible. There are actually interesting cases that might, like Dennett notes, it's actually not entirely clear what we should say about moral responsibility here. But in most cases, it seems like, if you're locked in a room, you're locally fated to be in the room. You can't do otherwise than be in the room. So what does Dennett say about this observation? So he says the question of being able to do otherwise turns out not to be central to what ordinary people do when they evaluate responsibility. Why is that? Well, firstly, when we consider when to praise somebody, we tend to simply ignore the question. That's like when people said above, like, anybody else would have done this, or what else could I have done? Those are cases when we praise somebody even though they would not or could not have done otherwise, or they claim that. And in those cases, we simply just ignore that fact and we praise them anyway. But if we're praising somebody, then they have to be responsible for what they did. Otherwise, why praise them? They were just, automata doing it. Okay, but that's a case of praise. What about blame? Well, when we consider when to blame somebody, we tend to be interested in the CDO question only up to the point of excluding local fatalism. That's why we brought this whole point up. So it seems like when we want to blame somebody, we're interested not in like this metaphysical question of could they have done otherwise. We're instead interested in whether or not they were locally fated to do what they did. It needs to be like, were they locked in a room? Were their hands tied behind their back? And if that was the case, then we should not blame them. And as a lot of people would argue, we should not hold them morally responsible. And Dennett thinks the upshot is that people, for these reasons, people don't say, ask whether microphysics and neurochemistry prevented them from doing otherwise. People are just not interested in that, Dennett claims. Instead, proponents of CDO as a requirement for responsibility or free will tend to view this particular question as important for assessing responsibility and blame. And Dennett's point is, well, if that's what we care about, responsibility and blame, then we just should not care about microphysics and neurochemistry. We should not care about the fact that there is only one future available to us. So even if determinism is true, we just shouldn't care. All right. And Dennett brings up further cases and further argumentation to support this. Here's a classic case. So this is Martin Luther. Martin Luther is the sort of founding father of the Reformation in the 1500s. And Luther famously is claimed to have said at the Diet of Worms, I'm mispronouncing both of those words. He said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Well, if you can do no other, then good job, Martin Luther. You're totally not free to you're not. We shouldn't hold you responsible for what you're doing. But clearly, when Martin Luther said, "Here I stand, I can do no other," he was not renouncing or rejecting his responsibility for what he was doing. Quite the contrary. He was saying, I'm doing what I think is most reasonable to do, and I'm freely doing it for the first time in my life. So that's totally what he thinks he's doing. He's not abjuring responsibility. Okay. Instead, and indeed, he cannot do otherwise precisely because he sees so clearly what the situation is, and because his rational control faculty is not impaired. Luther was pointing out the hypocrisy and contradictions of the interpretation of Scripture that was rampant in the Catholic Church at the time, or so Luther claims. And, I mean, that's precisely the kind of thing that's rational, that seems most in line with what we should do, and it seems like that's free. We can't, at least, if doing that undermines your freedom, then we shouldn't want to be free, right? Similarly with the claim that I would never agree to torture an innocent person for $1,000. So this is what Dennett says quite rightly. I mean, he thinks I would never torture an innocent person for $1,000. And why is that? Well, I just see so clearly that I shouldn't do that. And in that sense, I couldn't really do otherwise. I wouldn't do otherwise, and I couldn't do otherwise than fail to do this. I would never contract that. Okay, so here's a worry you might raise regarding Martin Luther. So in Luther-like cases, doesn't this just show that I'm behaving like a pre-programmed zombie? Not a P-zombie, but like a deterministic zombie. Doesn't a genuinely free agent need to be more volatile somehow? And if I cannot do otherwise, then it seems that I cannot rationally engage with reasons for and against a certain action. So what do you think of this? Well, we should have to focus on this last claim. If I cannot do otherwise, then it seems that I cannot rationally engage with reasons for and against a certain action. And Dennett thinks this latter claim is unsupported. He says, seeing both sides of the question does not require that one not be overwhelmingly persuaded, in the end, by one side. So, like, Dennett is saying, there will become a time when it is sort of psychologically impossible for you to change your mind, like Luther. But just because you're beyond changing your mind, I mean, just because you're so overwhelmingly persuaded by the good evidence in favor of a course of action, should not undermine your freedom. It shouldn't undermine your responsibility for the actions you undertake because of those reasons. It just seems like, I got a great reason. I have 400 reasons to go get a hot dog right now. If I have 400 reasons to get a hot dog right now, and I have 0 reasons against getting a hot dog right now, then, I might also say then, I am absolutely committed to doing that, and you cannot change my mind. In such a case, it seems like being able to do otherwise in this case does not seem to undermine my freedom. So Dennett's saying that the flexibility we're looking for is not the flexibility we want. The capacity to recognize the 1 in a zillion case in which we would say act differently in order to save the entire world is the case we do want. So this is a flexibility we do want. We want to be able to recognize the exceptions, the cases when actually there is a reason that undermines, say, my current beliefs. So, if I'm in the hot dog case, if somebody says, wait, Brian, here's the reason you didn't consider, the hot dog is laced with cyanide. I'd be like, oh, that's a good reason not to eat this, not to go, or maybe all the hot dogs in my area are laced with cyanide. That would be a really good reason to reassess my beliefs. And that would be maybe the 1 in a zillion case in which I should act differently. But, usually hot dogs are not laced with cyanide. Usually hot dogs are like a absolutely succulent thing to eat, which is unfortunate because I'm vegetarian. But, okay. Like Luther himself, when you look at what he said at the Diet of Worms, he says, unless I am convinced by the testimony of the Scriptures or by clear reason, I am bound by the Scriptures I have quoted, and my conscience is captive to the Word of God. I cannot and will not recant anything, since it is neither safe nor right to go against conscience. May God help me, amen. Okay, so this is a case where, Luther's just doubling down. He's just saying, I am captive to the Word of God, but not just the Word of God. He's not just being completely beholden to God in this case. It's also clear reason, and the reasoning that's the testimony that occurs in the Scriptures. So, gosh, it doesn't seem like Luther is being irrational here, or at least any less rational than his Catholic interlocutors. So it seems like this is all going to check out on Dennett's view. All right, so Question, what good would it be to know whether, when Jones pulled the trigger to kill his wife at time t, Jones could have done otherwise? So just consider that. What good? Like, what would we do differently if we knew facts about this? So, what good would it be to know whether when Jones pulled the trigger to kill his wife at time t, Jones could have done otherwise? Suppose that we did know that, given the microphysical states that constitute Jones and the physical state of Jones's environment at t, Jones could not have done otherwise. Does this help us? And Dennett says no. This kind of fact is not helpful for assessing character or for planning for the future. Why? Because, quote, a genuinely undetermined agent is no more flexible, versatile, sensitive to nuances, or reformable than a deterministic near duplicate would be. In other words, I mean, being undetermined isn't going to help you. So if instead of having only one choice ahead of you, now you have like 14 choices, and now we flip a coin. That isn't going to help you. So that's the kind of argument he's giving. And what Dennett wants to say is just the answer to the question, yes or no, to either of the questions, whether having one future or multiple possible futures is the real metaphysical fact, is just not going to help us in assessing the character of the person. So he tries to argue for this point by giving us an additional analogy. This is sort of the Dennett style MO. Dennett's really good at giving a sort of theoretical framework and a picture for what he means. So I'm going to try to make a picture of his merely verbal, his language that I think is picturesque. So let's consider robot design. Here's Bender from Futurama. In case you've not noticed, I have watched Futurama, which I've actually assigned no Futurama in this course, which is maybe a sin. Anyway, Bender from Futurama is a robot. Bender is also a funny robot because Bender has all of the vices you might associate with a human who lacks self-control. Okay, so that's kind of funny. So suppose we design a deterministic robot. We outfit it with a design, heuristics, protocols, and other information, so that it is a good agent. So we want to design a robot that's a good agent. Suppose that it executed some activity that destroyed something valuable. Okay, so here's what we got. We got this robot over here. We given it a bunch of different heuristics and protocols to make it be a good agent. And suppose this robot just destroyed something, knocked something over. So when we ask, could it have done otherwise, we're asking about the design of the robot. So we may wish to redesign it in order to make this sort of event even less likely in the future. This sort of problem less likely in the future. Okay. So what does Dennett mean by this redesign? So let's take two different cases. So let's hold fixed the design of the robot and alter the circumstances in which the robot behaves. So what does Bender do? All right, so here's a suboptimal design case. In the suboptimal design case, we have 5 different circumstances or situations, and each of these situations involves a different event. In situation 1, something valuable is destroyed. Situation 3, valuable destroyed. Situation 4, something valuable destroyed. Situations 2 and 5, they're not destroyed. So this is a case where, there's a lot of different situations. So situations 1, 3, and 4 are cases where we varied the circumstances but held fixed the design. But in all these different circumstances, the robot did something that a bad agent would do. In other words, the way we designed the robot kind of sucked. Because only in 2 circumstances did the robot do what we considered valuable. Whereas in the other circumstances, the robot did something that was value-destroying. And this is a case in which there's systematic error in the design, or as Dennett puts it, a foible or flaw that keeps coming up and that tends to deteriorate value. But okay, this this is not sub-optimal. This is now optimized design. All right. So hold fixed the design of the robot, alter the circumstances. Now what does Bender do? And this is now optimal design, or at least optimized design, when we've fixed the heuristics and we've redesigned the robot to do what we want it to do and for it to not destroy value. Well, now in all these circumstances, the robot behaves well. It doesn't destroy things of value. It behaves like a good agent. Now, what Dennett says is, sure, there are going to be some circumstances in which the robot will just inevitably behave poorly. So, here's an example. Suppose Bender got dust trapped in his circuits, and consequently made the wrong decision. And because of getting dust trapped in this particular circuit that almost never has dust trapped in it, Bender destroyed something of value. Well, if this is the only situation, or if this is one of 2 situations out of a million in which Bender does something wrong, then this is what Dennett calls a don't care design imperfection, which apparently is a notion in engineering. And we don't care about it because it involves an imperfection or a design flaw that occurs so rarely and is so bizarre that we just don't care about it. Whereas the normal circumstances, S1, 2, 3, and 5, are the ones we care about. They're the ones that are most normally faced by Bender. So what does Dennett say? He says, put the robot in a similar situation in the future, it will do something different. In fact, it will usually do the right thing. Its failure in S4 depended on nothing but the fact that something undesigned or unanticipatable happened to intervene in the process in a way that made an unfortunate difference. We couldn't anticipate it. But if we can't anticipate it, we can't really hold, we're not going to say that this robot has bad character. We're not going to say that the robot was designed poorly, merely because in this fluke case, it performed poorly. So Dennett's moral is to precisely draw this analogy between the character we as moral agents have with the design that Bender or a robot has as a moral agent or as an agent. So if the design of a robot does not portray a systematic weakness, what we might think of as a character flaw, then we should not care about whether it could have done otherwise. And when we do care about whether it could have done otherwise, we are asking about design or what we might think of as its character. We're not asking about other stuff. We care about whether holding your character fixed, you would do lamentable things in certain circumstances, and the difference between flukes and robust trends matters, as we just saw. Notice, what does not matter here is whether there's only one future available to you. The entire notion of being able to do otherwise has dropped out of our story of moral responsibility. And it's been replaced by this idea of having a kind of designed character. Okay. There's a different story we can tell. So let's turn more squarely to Minority Report and Huemer. This is Tom Cruise. Tom Cruise plays Dr. Anderton in this movie. Not much more to be said. This movie performed very well in box offices and was also critically acclaimed. It's a pretty famous movie of the 21st century, so you got to watch it. Minority Report is based on a short story by Philip K. Dick. Philip K. Dick is one of the great science fiction writers of all time, and we're actually not going to read any Philip K. Dick directly, which is unfortunate, but Minority Report is based on a short story by him. Philip K. Dick is also responsible for the stories behind the Amazon series Man in the High Castle. So, in addition to actually many things. The Matrix is also actually loosely based on a concept by Philip K. Dick. Okay, so Minority Report according to Huemer. So again, a lot is going on in Minority Report, but I think Minority Report is one of the things we're going to engage with this quarter that pretty squarely has a particular philosophical interest to it, namely the interest pertaining to free will. It also raises questions about, in political philosophy, regarding state control and whether we should adopt certain legal regimes. We're going to sort of bypass those questions today, but it's worth considering. So according to Huemer, what's going on in Minority Report? Well, if as one pre-crime officer asserts, the precogs see the future and they're never wrong, this can only mean that the future is predetermined. Okay, so we got precogs in the little vat, and they see the future, and they're never wrong. If all that's true, so we at the end of the movie, this might be a little bit suspect. But if all of that is true, this can only mean that the future is predetermined. And perhaps this means that the only individuals who can influence the future are the precogs themselves. Because I guess the idea is the precogs see the future and they're like, oh no, what we are seeing here is Smith murdering Jane Doe. Well, since Smith is murdering Jane Doe, we're going to deploy this precrime police force to stop Smith from murdering Jane Doe. The result? There's no murder. Well, you might think, well, if the precogs see the murder happening, then surely they must be able to stop the murder from happening. In other words, what they see is not what must happen, but instead what will happen unless they intervene. Okay, so this is the ... here, because this is actually, there's a lot of time paradoxes, as, in fact, Tom Cruise's character, Dr. Anderton, brings up in one of the opening scenes explaining the precogs. So, for example, Howard Marks could not have avoided his fate. Without intervention, he would have killed Sarah Marks and Donald Dubin no matter what. I mean, think about what would be true if, what would happen if this were not the case? What if Howard Marks could not have avoided his fate? Sorry, what if Howard Marks could have avoided his fate? Well, if he could have avoided his fate, then the precogs would not see a single future, according to what we know about free will. They would have seen two futures. They would have seen two, maybe three futures. And the precogs would not presumably be able to know which of those futures would be the future that took place, or that future that will take place. But if that's true, then, well, it seems like Howard Marks is not any longer fated to any particular action. It seems just like there's many different futures available. But it seems like what the precogs are doing only makes sense if there's one future that they are seeing, and in virtue of seeing that future, they know whether or not the precrime division should intervene in the case. Okay. But if that is all true, then it seems wrong to punish Howard Marks. But why is that? I mean, he's going to murder her. So that sucks. So, or in fact, double murder. Murder both of them. So why should we not punish him? Well, remember, moral responsibility requires free will, as we claim. And we cannot punish someone when they are not morally responsible for the action in question. Those are two very intuitive ideas. So if both of those are true, then it seems wrong to punish him. Well, Huemer notes at the outset that this, the idea that we should have a pre-crime division as a point of legal philosophy or political philosophy seems ethically doomed. Well, one reason is that, the way he phrases it is in terms of a dilemma. So a dilemma is when you have two choices, and usually you want in philosophy to have a dilemma be exhaustive, so you have to choose one or the other choice. And if you're arguing against somebody, you want both choices to be bad. All right? So both choices here are going to lead to unfortunate consequences. So if the alleged future criminals lack free will, then it is unjust to punish them, since they are not morally responsible for what they would have done. That seems to follow from what we just said. But take the other horn of the dilemma. Suppose that future criminals have free will. They don't lack it, but they have it. Well, in that case, it is unjust to punish them, since we cannot be sufficiently certain that they really would have committed the crime for which they are to be punished. So in both cases, it just seems like the pre-crime system shouldn't be happening. So we're going to consider why this is the case. All right. So remember the nature of free will. We have two ideas, the freedom to do otherwise and the sourced idea. We're going to focus primarily, as Huemer does, on the freedom to do otherwise condition here. So Huemer does a nice job of summarizing various different positions on free will. So I've been talking about determinism already a little bit, but here's a definition of determinism. Determinism is the view that given the state of the world at any time, only one future is possible. So like we had the diagram before, there's not many branchings in a deterministic world. In a deterministic world, one timeline is one timeline, and you can't get out of that timeline. Okay. Determinism is classically taken to undermine free will. So, for example, divine foreknowledge seems incompatible with free will. So if God knows everything, then it seems hard to explain why we are able to choose to do one thing over the other. For precisely the same reasons, actually, we just gave regarding the precogs. The precogs can see the future, and there's only one future to see, then, imagine if God could see multiple futures. Well, then God would not know which of the futures was the actual future. And if he did know which one was the actual future, then, well, we're back at square one. And in fact, a lot of medieval philosophy is dedicated to this philosophical and theological problem. Second point is that deterministic laws of nature. Well, if we have deterministic laws of nature, supposing God doesn't exist and we just have deterministic laws of nature, this also seems to undermine free will. Okay. So suppose I pull a trigger on the gun. How could I have done otherwise? Since microphysical and chemical processes cause my finger to contract, they would have to change. If they didn't change, then presumably my finger would still contract and pull the trigger. But then, so would processes antecedent to those microphysical processes. Ultimately, for me to have acted differently, a different causal chain would be required, stretching back to the Big Bang. But that is not the causal chain present in our universe. So, the idea is if determinism is true, then how on earth could I change all the events leading up to now that presumably necessitate a particular future? Well, I can't. So if that's the case, then it just seems like I'm strapped into my circumstances. So hard determinism concludes that because determinism is true, no one has free will. Okay, so it takes these stories, the moral of these stories according to hard determinism is just the view that, well, given how these stories unfold, it just shows that we don't have free will. We're like, classic case of, we're like billiard balls. And billiard balls are very, geometrically determined about how they move around. Just ask any pool player. There's very specific geometrical principles that determine how the billiard balls work. And hard determinism is taken to be worrisome for other reasons, and it has to do with the implications of this idea that we don't have free will. So suppose free will is a necessary condition on moral responsibility. If no one has free will, then no one is responsible for their actions. But if no one's responsible for their actions, then no one can deserve praise or blame. We've seen this again and again. We might go on praising and blaming people, but not because they deserve it. So, people might think we can still praise and blame, but then it just, praising and blaming serves some sort of, instrumental, psychological function, that has nothing to do with the desert people have. You can look in the literature and philosophy for more on this, but nobody could deserve praise or blame in such a world. So, for example, genocidal murderers do not deserve blame. And that seems unfortunate. Because if anybody, it seems like genocidal murderers intuitively deserve blame. Okay. Well, there are ways that people try to get around this. So instead of taking determinism to undermine free will, other determinists believe that determinism is actually not a problem for free will. Soft determinism, which is often just called compatibilism, maintains that even if determinism is true, we can still have free will anyway. Okay, so how? Here are some options. One is to just reconsider our notion of possibility. So in one sense, only one future is possible, but in another sense, there are multiple possible futures. So this trades on our way of understanding what is possible or what can be done. So, take some classic examples of you getting to philosophical debates with your friends. So if you're like, I can't fly, and then your friends are like, well, you could fly. And then you're like, no, I can't. And they're like, oh, no, you. And then they're like, no, you could fly. Here's how you could fly. outfit yourself with mechanical wings, which presumably like the Department of Defense has figured out how to do this. Well, then you could be like, well, okay, in that sense, I can fly. But there's another sense in which I can't fly. And then we might make a distinction between two strengths of possibility or two notions of possibility. One might be like the notion of biological possibility, which is like, just based on my biology alone, I can't fly. But maybe it's sort of mechanically it's an engineering possibility for me to fly. Maybe I could put on wings and start flying. Similarly, like, can I speak Russian? Well, maybe it's like right now I am not able to speak Russian now. But maybe the idea is, well, I can speak Russian. It's just that I'd have to learn it. So it's possible for me to speak Russian. It's just that I can't do it now. So those are different notions of possibility. And Huemer notes that there's a notion of possibility that's important for compatibilists. So they might propose the following, that S can do X means if S tried to do X, then S would succeed at doing X. In this sense, there are alternate possibilities open to agents, even if all actions are determined by antecedent causes. Okay, so suppose there are two actions A and B such that if I tried to do them, then I would succeed in doing them. Even though I'm in fact determined to try A and not B, I have alternate possibilities available in the following sense. If I tried to do either of them, I would succeed. So this is just relocating where we should talk about alternate possibilities. Maybe it is it's physically or microphysically impossible for me to do otherwise. But maybe the idea is, well, it's motivationally possible. If I tried to do something, I could. If I tried to do something, I could do it. All right. And these are supposed to be different notions of possibility or different strengths of possibility. Option 2. To be free means to be free of external impediments to action. Or to be free requires only that one's action be determined by internal causes rather than by external forces. And if so, these requirements seem compatible with determinism. Okay? So, again, you might think, well, here's what I care about with free will. I care that people aren't external to me and, getting in my grill. I want to be my own master. So if I'm going to be my own master, I have to have internal causes that cause my actions. I don't want to be a puppet that's, beholden to external forces. And that's what I care about with free will. A third option is a jujitsu move. And that's to say that, well, freedom actually requires determinism. Ta-da! Not only is it not incompatible with determinism, but free will has as a necessary condition determinism. All right, so that's from real philosophical karate, to mix metaphors. If our actions were not determined by antecedent causes, then they would be random occurrences. But random occurrences are in no one's control, so there would be no free will. So, this is a bunch of noise right here that you might get on a television signal. Well, if my actions are like this, they're just completely random, then of course I'm not free. It's just like every time I determine whether or not I should murder somebody, I flip a coin. I'm like, coin, heads, oh good, I don't have to murder anyone today. That seems like no better than the case in which I'm determined not to murder or determined to murder somebody. And in none of those cases, it seems like, do I have free will? So there's a cottage industry of objections to soft determinism or objections to compatibilism. You might think of Daniel Dennett's article as one of them. You might think of Daniel Dennett's article as proposing a form of compatibilism that tries to deal with these objections. Daniel Dennett, most readings, is a compatibilist. Okay, so in other words, Daniel Dennett is a soft determinist. He thinks determinism and free will are compatible. But we're looking at objections here. So again, we're looking at why is this picture of the universe okay for free will? Here's an objection to the soft determinist view. If determinism is true, then our actions are the consequences of the laws of nature and events in the remote past. But it is not up to us what went on before we were born, and neither is it up to us what the laws of nature are. Therefore, the consequences of these things, including our present acts, are not up to us. So I can't go back and fiddle with the configuration of the world right after the Big Bang. Like what happened here was very consequential for everything that happened after it, but we can't change what happened here. Okay? But if that's true, then it follows that I lack access to these alternate possibilities. But then it just seems like we're intuitively back to where we started. It seems like I cannot do otherwise, and the fact that I can't do otherwise is a serious problem for when I'm trying to consider whether I have free will. Okay. So you might just think here, well, there's a big standoff between two camps. One who insists that we need to be able to do otherwise in a particular sense. Namely, we have to be able to change the course of the universe. And another camp that says, no, we don't need to change the course of the universe in order for our actions to be freely willed. So you might just view this as being a standoff. And in fact, there's a philosophical tradition of a lot of mudslinging, we might say. So Immanuel Kant, who is one of the most influential writers on free will, calls compatibilism a wretched subterfuge and mere word jugglery. Okay, so that's harsh. Kant was himself, Kant's own view is actually very, very complex, but Kant himself believed in free will, and he also believed that the course of nature was determined by the laws of nature. He thought we lived in a deterministic physical world. However, he thinks there's another world in which the laws of nature do not apply. So that's a sort of different move. Anyway, there's a tradition of mudslinging. Okay, there's another form of incompatibilism. So we already looked at hard incompatibilism. Here's another form of incompatibilism called libertarianism. Libertarianism, in this case, is not associated with Ayn Rand. Okay, so get that out of your mind. Hopefully nothing is associated with Ayn Rand. Anyway, libertarianism holds that free will exists and free will is incompatible with determinism. But libertarians infer from these premises that determinism must be false. Whoa. Okay, so it's like free will is, we should actually be more committed to the existence of free will than we are to the idea that determinism must be true. Okay. So suppose you were born in the position of John Anderton, face to face with Leo Crow and about to kill him. Really get into his skin. Doesn't it seem like you could choose either way? Like, doesn't it really just seem like you have a strong intuitive sense, like, I can either kill or not kill? Or take a more mundane case, doesn't it seem like I can pick this up now or not? Like, yes, I did. Or, no, I didn't. Hard determinists call this an illusion, but is there more compelling contrary evidence from hard determinists that we should discount your sense that you could do otherwise in the situation? One way to view this is like, look, let's look back at our friends' sufficient and necessary conditions. We've been saying all along that, determinism is true, has as a necessary condition that we could not do otherwise. In other words, it is sufficient. The fact that determinism is true is sufficient to show that we could not do otherwise. But what does libertarianism say? Well, first of all, it's saying, good job, determinism. You in fact do entail that we cannot do otherwise. Libertarians are like, this conditional is totally true. However, libertarians say, instead of saying that the sufficient condition is supported, instead of saying that we should endorse the sufficient condition, that determinism is true, we should instead reject the necessary condition for determinism being true. We should reject that we could not do otherwise. And we should infer that the necessary condition for determinism being true fails. Whoa. Okay, so that's a serious position. And Huemer is actually going to kind of plug for something like this. He's going to say that hard determinism is self-defeating. And we should instead say, no. And this kind of argument has a lineage going back to Epicurus, who says the man who says that all things come to pass by necessity cannot criticize one who denies that all things come to pass by necessity, for he admits that this happens of necessity. wouldn't it be true that my beliefs and assertions are equally determined as my actions? So the physical determinist would need to give a plausible account of reasons and evidence in purely physical terms, if such a determinist thought of their own view as reasonable or based on evidence. I mean, think about this. We have norms that are implicit in all of our activities. When we assert something, there's a truth norm, many people think. So when I assert that the sky is blue, I'm asserting it as true. And contrast that case with one in which I am just reciting lines in a play. When I'm doing that, I don't care whether they're true. And in this case, lying is like breaking the rules of chess. I got rules that I'm supposed to abide by when I assert things. And when I assert things, I'm supposed to say things that are true. But when I'm lying, I'm flaunting those norms. I'm breaking the rules, or breaking the laws of chess, or breaking the laws of assertion. So same thing goes for reasoning. I have a justification norm for reasoning. And if I don't abide by this justification norm, if I don't try to make sure that all of my thoughts support one another, then my train of thoughts is mere sophistry or political rhetoric or something that is not good reasoning. So why does Huemer think that hard incompatibilism is self-defeating? Well, he says, we should refrain from accepting unjustified beliefs. There's a premise, so fair enough. Secondly, to say that one should do something implies that one can do it. This is a so-called ought implies can principle. It makes sense in light of what we just said. It's just saying, if I ought to do something, then I need to be able to do it. If you're saying that I ought to go to the store today, you should only say that if you also think that I can go to the store today. If I'm locked in a room and I'm locally fated to be locked in a room all day, then it can't be true that I ought to go to the store. Okay. Third, we can refrain from accepting unjustified beliefs. Why? Well, because of premises 1 and 2. Because again, if we ought to refrain from accepting unjustified beliefs, then it implies that we can refrain from accepting unjustified beliefs. Well, assume that hard determinism is true. Then what we actually do is the only thing we can do. That is, what can be done is done. According to hard determinism, there's just one timeline, no branching. Whatever we can do actually happens. We can't do what we don't do, right? So we can't do what we don't do. So it's one way to think of this is that what we actually do collapses into what we can do, and vice versa. Okay, 5. Therefore, we have no unjustified beliefs. And this follows logically from 3 and 4. Okay, so if we can refrain from accepting unjustified beliefs, then we have no unjustified beliefs. Why? Because all the beliefs that we can have, we do have. And, we can't refrain from having the beliefs that we have. So we have no unjustified beliefs, if that's true. 6, many people believe in free will. Premise. 6 is like, just look around. People believe in it. 7, so the belief in free will is justified. A crucial premise here is 3. Okay? Because 3 got us the crucial premise 5. 3 says, we can refrain from accepting unjustified beliefs. Right. So, actually, wait, sorry. Reboot that. The crucial premise I meant to motion to was premise 2. Premise 2 says, to say that one should do something implies that one can do it. This is doing a lot of work. This so-called ought implies can principle is very important. Because the idea is like, if we can't do other than what we do, then we can't be obligated to do what we don't do. If that's true, then whatever we believe, we just have justification for. So the belief in free will itself must be justified. And Huemer, notes he wants to hedge his bets a little bit, and he says, the point is not that the above deduction proves that we have free will. Rather, the point is that it is not rational to embrace hard determinism, since hard determinism in conjunction with the norms of implicit reasoning leads to a conclusion that rationally undermines hard determinism itself. Okay, So what should we say about Precrime to close up? And if this was confusing, the argument we just saw, we'll review it in discussion session. The characters of Minority Report interpret the existence of minority reports as evidence of free will. So the minority reports are again the reports that indicate that precogs can contradict one another's views of the future. A determinist would say, well, the existence of minority reports just shows that the precogs are fallible. It's not like the minority reports show that the metaphysics is wrong. It just shows that we are wrong about the epistemology of the precogs. We're just wrong about the idea that the precogs are infallible. And on their view, we should abandon the precrime system at the end of the movie, only if it results in more innocent people being targeted than without the precrime system. In other words, look, just because the precogs get things wrong does not mean we should get rid of the precrime system. Because, look, our everyday trial system also makes a lot of mistakes. So you need to show that the old justice system, the pre-crime system, is less fallible than the precogs. That it's less fallible than the pre-crime system that involves the predictions of the precogs. Otherwise, this objection is not a good objection. And the determinists would have to have some other reason for why we should abandon the precrime system. A second view, the libertarian view, would be more along Huemer's lines, which would say that we should interpret the existence of minority reports as reflecting the reality of human freedom, the metaphysical fact that we are free. In other words, at least some of the time, it is not yet determined whether a person will commit a crime, so at most we can say that they will probably commit a crime. But then precrime should be abolished because it would involve locking people up who don't deserve punishment. Why is that? Well, because there's still the probability that they will not commit the crime. And crucially, what makes it the case that they do not commit the crime is a free choice on their parts. So unless they actually make the free choice to do the wrong thing, they don't deserve punishment. And Huemer's conclusion is that ultimately the people in Minority Report probably made the right decision in abolishing the precrime system, but for the wrong reasons. The wrong reason to abolish precrime is that the system is fallible. The right reason is that individuals have free will and do not merit punishment for future actions, however likely, that are not yet determined. So I just wanted to note, we want to think, and I'll leave you with this question, should we think that Howard Marks has free will in Minority Report? And much of this will turn on our background assumptions regarding whether determinism is true and how determinism undermines, supports, or fails to undermine free will. And the arguments we just saw give us a bunch of different ways of thinking about whether and how determinism undermines, supports, or fails to undermine free will. So that's it for this week. Next week we're going to turn to different stuff altogether. We're going to look at, largely we're going to turn away from sort of meta-ethical questions and metaphysical, epistemic questions or questions about psychology, and look more at society and what a good society would look like, and whether it's just to intervene in other societies, in colonialist acts or other forms of action. So I'll see you then.